The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of the small ranch house in Millbrook, Colorado, casting long shadows across the worn wooden table. Sarah Chen sat with her hands wrapped around a cold coffee mug, staring at nothing in particular. It was 6 a.m. on a Tuesday, and she had nowhere to be anymore. For 15 years, Captain Sarah Chen had been a pilot in the Air Force. 15 years of early mornings, late nights, and a sense of purpose that had defined every single day of her adult life. Now, at 42 years old, she was retired, medically discharged to be specific. A knee injury from a training exercise that had gotten infected had ended her career before she was ready to let it go. Her small house sat on the edge of Millbrook, a town of about 8,000 people nestled in the Colorado foothills. Most of the residents worked at the manufacturing plant on the highway, or they commuted to Denver for jobs. Sarah had chosen this place because it was quiet, because it was far from the military bases where everyone knew her or thought they did. She stood up slowly, her knee stiff despite the 3 months of physical therapy. Through the window, she could see her neighbor, Tom Wilson, loading his truck for work. He glanced at her house and quickly looked away. That happened a lot lately. Sarah had been a decorated pilot. She had flown combat missions in 3 different countries. She had a commendation for extraordinary service, but none of that mattered in Millbrook. Here, she was just the woman with the bad leg. The woman who was probably collecting disability for nothing. The woman who didn't work while others woke up at 5 every morning to earn their paycheck. That was what the coffee shop crowd assumed anyway. Sarah had learned that quickly. Her phone buzzed. A text from her former commanding officer, Colonel James Mitchell. "How are you holding up? Been thinking about you. Let's grab lunch if you're free." Sarah smiled. Jim Mitchell was one of the good ones. He had actually fought for her during the discharge process, insisting that they explore other options before medical retirement was finalized. But even he understood that there was no flying in her future. The mobility required for emergency ejection procedures, the split-second reactions needed in a combat aircraft, a knee that sometimes buckled without warning just couldn't cut it anymore. She texted back, "Thanks, Jim, maybe this weekend, still getting used to regular life." That was the truth. Regular life felt empty. Sarah wasn't married. She'd never had time for a serious relationship. The Air Force had been her whole world, her family, her identity. And now that it was gone, she was discovering just how much of her she had left behind when she hung up her flight suit for the last time. The physical pain of her injury was nothing compared to the psychological ache of losing something she loved so much. That afternoon, Sarah drove into town to pick up groceries. Millbrook's downtown consisted of one main street with a cluster of shops, a diner, a bank, and a coffee place called Brew and Bean. She parked carefully, taking extra time because her knee didn't like her hurrying. Inside the grocery store, she grabbed a basket and headed for the produce section. She was reaching for some apples when she heard a familiar voice. "Well, look who it is." Sarah turned to see Janet Hartley, who had been 2 years ahead of her in high school. Janet had never left Millbrook. She'd married the high school quarterback, had 2 kids, and seemed to know everyone's business. "Hi, Janet," Sarah said with genuine friendliness. "How's everything?" "Oh, working hard, unlike some people." Janet laughed, but there was an edge to it. "My husband says you're on the government dole now. Must be nice, staying home while the rest of us work for a living." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. "I served my country for 15 years, Janet." "Yeah, but that's the thing, isn't it? You're not anymore, so now you're just like everyone else except you don't actually have a job." Janet smiled like she'd said something clever. "Anyway, nice seeing you. Tell your mom I said hi." Sarah watched Janet push her cart away, feeling the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. This was the hardest part of coming home. This was the part nobody in the military ever prepared you for. That evening, Sarah attended a town hall meeting about a proposed new business development near the edge of Millbrook. She went because she wanted to stay involved in her community, because she was trying to build a life here now, whether she wanted to or not. The meeting was held in the high school gymnasium. About 200 people showed up. Sarah sat in the middle of the bleachers, listening as the town council members explained that a private aviation contractor wanted to lease some land to build a repair facility for military aircraft. It would bring jobs, it would bring tax revenue, it would be good for Millbrook. But several people had concerns. There would be noise from the aircraft, there would be more traffic, there would be safety considerations. Sarah listened carefully. As someone who knew military aviation inside and out, she had valuable insights. During the public comment period, she stood up. It took her a moment because of her knee, and she noticed people watching her with that look she'd come to recognize. The look of someone seeing her as broken, damaged. "I think this is a good opportunity for Millbrook," she said, her voice steady and clear from 15 years of speaking over radio static and in military briefings. "But there are important regulations we need to consider. Military aircraft require specific landing protocols. We need to make sure the facility has proper separation distances from residential areas, and the developer needs to obtain federal certifications before operations begin." She sat back down. The council members nodded. They seemed to appreciate her input. Several people turned to look at her with actual interest. But then Doug Patterson, who owned the hardware store and served on the town council, leaned over to the mayor and whispered something. Sarah couldn't hear what he said, but she heard the mayor's response. "She doesn't work here anyway. What does it matter to her?" The comment was loud enough to carry. People nearby had heard it. Sarah felt her face flush. She knew exactly what Doug meant. She was an outsider, a burden on the system. Why should someone on disability benefits get a say in how the town developed? After the meeting, Sarah limped to her car. Jim Mitchell called as she was driving home. "Hey, how's your week going?" he asked. "It's been a week," Sarah said honestly. "People around here don't really understand why I can't just get another job. They think I'm lazy." Jim was quiet for a moment. "Sarah, you know what you've given up for this country, right? You know it in your bones." "Yeah, but knowing it and having other people understand it are two different things." "That's true," Jim said. "Listen, I actually called about something else. Something's come up at the base. Nothing major, but we're revamping some of our training programs, and I'd love to get your input. Would you be interested in doing some consulting work? Just a few hours a week. Doesn't have to be anything official." Sarah's heart lifted for just a moment. Then it fell again. "Jim, I appreciate that, but I think you're doing me a favor because you feel sorry for me." "That's not true," Jim said firmly. "But if you're not interested, you're not interested. Just think about it. The offer stands whenever you're ready." After they hung up, Sarah drove through Millbrook's quiet streets, past the houses where people were having dinner with their families, past the places where she didn't quite fit in anymore. She had flown a 10 Thunderbolt aircraft. She had made decisions that saved lives. She had been trained to handle pressure at levels most people couldn't even imagine. But she couldn't seem to handle the simple, casual cruelty of small-town judgment. That night, Sarah sat on her porch with a cup of tea, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Tomorrow would be the same as today, and the day after that would be the same too, unless something changed. She didn't know it yet, but something was about to change in ways she could never have anticipated. 3 weeks later, Sarah received a phone call that turned everything upside down. It was early morning, around 7 o'clock. She was on her porch again, her knee wrapped in an ice pack when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Department of Defense. Her heart immediately went into overdrive. The DoD didn't just call people randomly. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. "Ms. Chen," a woman's voice asked. She sounded official, professional. "This is Lieutenant Commander Rachel Torres from the Office of Military Personnel. I'm calling about your service record." "Okay," Sarah said carefully. "What about my service record?" "We've discovered a significant discrepancy," Torres said. "Are you able to talk right now? This is somewhat sensitive." Sarah's hands started to shake. She went inside the house and sat down. "Yeah, I can talk." "Your discharge paperwork indicates you were medically retired due to a knee injury sustained during training," Torres said. "Is that correct?" "That's correct." "And you were notified of your discharge on March 15th of this year?" "Yes." "Ms. Chen, I'm going to be direct. We've been conducting a routine audit of discharge procedures, and we found something that's very concerning. Your discharge was not properly authorized by the appropriate command structure. Additionally, there are notations in your file that suggest your injury may have been exacerbated by inadequate medical response time." Sarah sat up straight. "What do you mean, inadequately authorized?" "I mean that based on our review, your discharge should not have gone through without additional consultation from the air surgeon's office. Additionally, the incident report from your injury has some inconsistencies that warrant further investigation." Sarah's mind was spinning. What kind of inconsistencies? That's what we'd like to determine, Torres said. I'd like to schedule a formal interview with you. We're also going to be requesting records from the medical facility that treated you. This will take a few weeks, but I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence for nearly an hour. Her discharge was a mistake, a procedural error, and there were inconsistencies in her injury report. She thought back to that day. She'd been doing advanced landing procedures training, practicing emergency stops. Her knee had given out during a precision maneuver. She'd fallen hard. The pain had been intense, but she'd walked it off initially. The base medical clinic had examined her, done some x-rays, and referred her to a specialist. The specialist had found an infection in the joint, something called septic arthritis. By the time they'd caught it, the damage was already extensive. Sarah had accepted her discharge because she'd been told it was necessary. Because the doctors had said her joint couldn't handle the stress of flying anymore. Because it had seemed like the only option. But now, apparently, that hadn't been the whole story. She called Jim Mitchell immediately. "This is weird," Jim said after she'd explained the call. "Sarah, this kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. If your discharge was improperly authorized, somebody didn't follow protocol. The question is whether that was negligence or something more deliberate." "Why would anyone deliberately mess up my discharge?" Sarah asked. "I don't know yet," Jim said. "But I'm going to find out. Don't talk to anyone about this call until we understand what's happening." Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah tried to act like everything was normal. But it was hard. She'd lie awake at night thinking about her injury, wondering what she'd missed, wondering who might have been involved. Then she received an actual letter in the mail. It was from the Office of the Inspector General, the military's internal investigative body. The letter was short and formal, but it contained a bombshell. The letter stated that an investigation had been initiated regarding potential irregularities in your discharge procedures. It noted that the investigation would look into 3 specific areas: whether proper authorization had been obtained, whether adequate time had been given for alternative medical treatments, and whether your commanding officer and medical personnel had followed established protocols. The letter concluded with a name: Investigation assigned to Special Agent Marcus Webb, Office of the Air Force Inspector General. Sarah read the letter 3 times. It felt unreal, as if she was reading about someone else's life. That evening, Jim called her again. "I've been asking some discreet questions," he said. "Sarah, I found something. Your original discharge paperwork was signed off by Lieutenant Colonel David Brennan. He was your base commander at the time." Sarah remembered Brennan. He was a career officer, ambitious, always looking for ways to improve the numbers and metrics on his base. He'd never been particularly warm to her, but he'd never been hostile either, just distant. Professional in a way that didn't leave much room for actual human connection. "Why would Brennan have signed off improperly?" Sarah asked. "That's the question," Jim said. "But here's what I found out. 2 weeks after your discharge, Brennan got promoted ahead of schedule. Now, promotions can happen for lots of reasons, but the timing is interesting. You think someone promoted him to cover something up?" "I think it's worth looking into," Jim said carefully. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer. When you had your injury, do you remember anyone suggesting that you might be a problem? Anyone treating you differently after it happened?" Sarah thought back. "Not really. I mean, I was in pain, but everyone seemed sympathetic." "Did Brennan ever talk to you about it?" "No, not directly. I remember seeing him once when I was limping through the hallway. He asked if I was okay, and I said I was fine. That was it." "Okay," Jim said. "Listen, Agent Webb is going to want to talk to you. When he does, I want you to tell him everything you remember, everything, even the little things that don't seem important." "Jim, what's going on? Why would anyone care this much about my discharge?" Jim hesitated. "I don't know yet, but my gut is telling me that there's something bigger here, something that might affect other people too." A week later, Sarah got another call. This time it was from Agent Marcus Webb himself. He wanted to meet with her at a DoD facility in Denver. He was professional and polite, but there was an intensity to him that suggested he knew something she didn't. The interview took 3 hours. Webb asked her about the day of her injury in meticulous detail. When exactly did it happen? What was the weather like? Who was present? How quickly did medical personnel arrive? Then he asked her something that caught her off guard. Ms. Chen, did you ever receive any communications from Lieutenant Colonel Brennan suggesting that your injury might be a reason to end your military service? Sarah thought hard. No, but now that you mention it, he did seem to make a point of being around when my condition was being discussed. He asked the doctor questions about prognosis, about whether I'd be able to continue flying. Did that seem unusual to you at the time? A little, Sarah admitted, but commanders take an interest in their personnel's medical situations. Webb made a note. What I'm about to tell you is not yet public, so I need your discretion, he said. Lieutenant Colonel Brennan has been under investigation for financial improprieties. We believe he's been taking kickbacks from contractors. We also believe that he may have been using his position to discharge personnel who were becoming problems for him, people whose questions or observations might have brought attention to his activities. Sarah felt like she'd been punched. You're saying my discharge was deliberate to get rid of me? I'm saying it's one of the things we're investigating, Webb said carefully. Tell me, did you ever raise any concerns about base operations or budget issues to anyone? Sarah thought back. Actually, yes. About a month before my injury, I noticed some inconsistencies in the maintenance logs for the aircraft. The logs showed more service hours than the planes had actually flown. I mentioned it to my flight supervisor. Webb nodded slowly, and what happened? Nothing. My supervisor said he'd look into it, and then I dropped it because I was busy with other things. And then I got hurt. And your supervisor was? Captain Derek Hughes. Webb wrote the name down. We'll be following up on that. Ms. Chen, I appreciate you talking with me. What I can tell you right now is that your discharge is being investigated as potentially improper. Depending on what we find, there may be options for you. After the interview, Sarah drove back to Millbrook in a daze. Options for her? What did that mean? She spent that night packing her small house, her knee forgot and her mind racing. She thought about the past 3 months, about feeling worthless, about the judgment she'd faced from people in her town, about lying awake wondering if she'd somehow let herself down. What if none of it had been her fault? What if she'd been pushed out for knowing something she shouldn't have known? The next morning, Sarah called Jim Mitchell again. I'm authorizing you to tell me everything you know, she said. About Brennan, about the investigation, all of it. Jim took a deep breath. Okay, but first I want to ask you something. Are you ready for what might come next? I'm ready, Sarah said. For the first time in 3 months, I actually feel ready for something. Over the next 4 weeks, Sarah became increasingly involved in what Jim explained was now a full federal investigation into Lieutenant Colonel Brennan's command. Agent Webb called her twice more with follow-up questions. Each time he seemed to know more. Each time he seemed to be building a case. Sarah started going back to the base 1 or 2 days a week to give detailed statements and review records. The base was strange to her now. She would walk the hallways in civilian clothes, a visitor rather than a soldier. Some people she'd flown with would acknowledge her with a nod or a quiet hello. Others seemed uncomfortable, as if her presence was a reminder of something they'd rather forget. It was during one of these trips that she ran into Captain Derek Hughes, her former flight supervisor. She was in the cafeteria, and he spotted her from across the room. He got up and walked over to her table, his expression unreadable. Sarah, he said quietly, can we talk? They found a quiet corner outside the cafeteria. Derek looked troubled, like he hadn't been sleeping well. I've been questioned about what you reported to me, he said, about the maintenance logs. I know, Sarah said. The investigators asked me about it too. I need you to know something, Derek said. I did look into it, and I found what you found. The logs didn't match up, so I reported it to Brennan. Sarah's stomach dropped. What did he say? He told me not to file a formal report. He said there was probably just a data entry error and that filing an official report would create a lot of unnecessary paperwork and investigation. Derek's voice was heavy with guilt. I knew I should have pushed back. I knew it wasn't right. But Sarah Brennan was my commanding officer. I had just made captain. I was trying to make a good impression. I was scared that if I raised a fuss, it would hurt my career. Sarah heard the guilt in his voice, and she also heard the truth. Derek, did you know what he was doing? The financial stuff. Not at first, Derek said. But over time, things didn't add up. The way equipment was being maintained by certain contractors. The way certain people seemed to have access to resources they shouldn't have had. When you got discharged so quickly after raising the maintenance issue, I started putting pieces together. I've been trying to work up the courage to talk to the investigators." "You should," Sarah said gently. "You need to tell them everything.